Our next speaker was born in Iowa. He received his law degree from Georgetown University in 1977 and moved to Georgia in 1978, where he began to practice law. 1986, he won appointment from President Reagan as a U.S. attorney and served in that post until 1990. He then led the Southeastern Legal Foundation, a public interest law firm. In 1994, in his first try at elective office, he became the congressman for the 7th District of Georgia, the seat once held by the late Larry McDonald. He serves on the all-important Judiciary Committee and on the Government Reform and Oversight Committee. Re-elected in 1996, he serves on the all-important committee which is entertaining the possibility of bringing impeachment charges against President Bill Clinton. His very informative interview appeared in the New American in August 1997. I'm delighted to say that I have here a copy of his trim bulletin, All Stars, second one in a row. Now, since the Arkansas judge threw out the Paula Jones versus Bill Clinton suit, many in Congress and elsewhere have claimed that the president is out of the woods, that there's no more reason for impeachment. We know that's wishful thinking on the part of the president and his gaggle of followers. And so does our speaker, who continues to point to the gross illegalities regarding campaign funds that came from Red China, abuse of office, usurpation of power, stonewalling, etc. He's still working hard to bring this rogue president to account. So it's a special pleasure and a privilege to introduce our good friend from Georgia, Congressman Bob Barr.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you all. Thank you, Jack and Vance and head table friends and everybody out here. It's wonderful to be invited back. Jerry and I enjoyed our visit to Northern California with you all back in October, and it is a special honor, a singular honor, to be invited back here. I had enjoyed the keynote speech last time by Ron Paul, and know that he truly is a great congressman, and we're lucky to have him there. Oh, but I wish we had more like him. But we certainly do appreciate him. I must tell you, I've heard with people from all the areas around here, I've heard some people during the reception before dinner complain about some of the folks that represent them here in this area. And I must tell you that as much of a burden as it is sometime to be represented by a Tom Lantos or a Henry Waxman, y'all have it easy. Y'all don't have Jane Fonda from your state. She's back. Y'all, I don't know whether y'all read this, but little Miss Fonda was up at the United Nations, no surprise there, earlier this week. And while with her colleagues and I'm sure very dear friends at the United Nations, she shared with them her thoughts on her state. Well, though she spends little time in Georgia, of course, being married to Ted Turner, she does come down there every once in a while, but shared with her friends at the United Nations her thoughts that Georgia is no better than some third world country. So she's back, unfortunately, and we continue to harbor under the disgrace of having her claim even a remote relationship to Georgia. So no matter how bad it may seem to have Henry Waxman or Tom Lantos, it could be worse. Thank goodness for little favors. Jerry and I were watching a program on TV not too long ago, and the person who was the primary person on this particular show was somebody that I really marveled at. He bounced back from everything that his opponent could throw at him. He seemed constantly to be on the go, and nothing could be made to stick to him or hurt him, no matter how much of an onslaught he was subject to. It seemed that he was sort of a Teflon person, and he always bounced back. There were really no consequences to what he did. He just didn't seem to have to worry. It's not who you might be thinking of about whom I speak. I was watching a program of Wile E. Coyote. I don't know how many of you all know Mr. Wile E. Coyote, but I always enjoy watching Wile E. Coyote because he always bounces back. No matter how many thousands of feet that huge stone falls, it doesn't seem to hurt him. No matter how many pounds of dynamite explode under him, he's always okay. And indeed, in a cartoon world, there are no consequences. You don't have to be responsible for what you do because you will always bounce back. Unfortunately, we don't live in a cartoon world, although sometimes it seems that we are becoming a cartoon culture. We know, certainly the John Birch Society knows, that in a real world, real actions have real consequences, sometimes very tragic consequences. And it's this discrepancy between a cartoon world in which our president seems to be living, a cartoon culture, and the consequences of those actions. He may not have to, he basically doesn't care what the consequences are, but we do, and we have to live with them. Now, I'd like to speak a little bit this evening about these two worlds. In the world of Wile E. Coyote, if you have an adversary and you give that adversary the means to destroy you, it doesn't really matter, because in a cartoon world, you don't get destroyed. You always bounce back. You don't have to worry about what you do. You don't have to worry about what secrets of missile technology you disclose to an adversarial nation. You don't have to worry about disclosing to an adversarial nation technology that can be used to strengthen and improve vastly over what they had, the guidance systems for their missiles, because even if their missiles are later in the show aimed towards you and launched and explode, you always bounce back. So why worry? After all, it's just one big cartoon world, one global culture, as it were. In a cartoon world also, I suppose, you don't have to really worry about whether or not you have an immigration policy that is adhered to. In a cartoon world, I suppose, you could rush through, just prior to an election, thousands upon thousands of citizens from other countries, naturalize them to be citizens of your country, hypothetically the United States of America, let's say, and not really worry that perhaps 11 or 12,000 that we may now know about, and that we do now know about at a minimum, of those people rushed through the naturalization process just prior to an election in the hopes that they would vote for your party, had criminal records in their criminal history, many serious felony convictions in their own countries, and were ineligible thereby under U.S. law to become citizens of this great country. Because in a cartoon world, it doesn't really matter. Even if you are then later on in that cartoon world so unfortunate to be living next door to one of those new citizens who decides that they will commit the same felony act here that they did back in their own country, and for which they should have been and were in fact ineligible to become U.S. citizens, but were because of a program in which our vice president was in charge called Citizenship 2000, it doesn't really matter, because in that cartoon world, Murders don't happen. Drug deals don't go bad. Arson doesn't take place, or if it does, nothing's really burned down. But in a real world, in this country, to have at least 12,000 people on the streets of America as full-fledged American citizens who had no right to be citizens, and the reason they had no right to be citizens was because they had felony criminal records in their home country, has very real consequences. And we may never know exactly what those consequences are, because once a person is naturalized in this country, we have no way of really tracking them, easily certainly. And hopefully we never will have some way that we can track every citizen easily. But the problem is, in America, it is not easy to track these people. Moreover, it is very difficult. As a matter of fact, it is a practical impossibility to revoke their citizenship. It is a very difficult process to go through. But again, in the cartoon world in which our leaders are operating, it's okay, because criminal acts, even if they occur, you always bounce back from them. In that cartoon culture, real acts don't have real consequences, but in the real world, they do. In the real world, if you teach our students, our children, that no one culture is better than another, that the family is not important, at least the family as it has been handed down to us as the basic building block of our society and every positive society in the history of the world, is really not that important. If you teach them that homosexuality is at least as good as heterosexuality, if you teach them that you cannot have ethics or morals because, by definition, inherently, if you teach morals or ethics, you are saying that one thing is better than another, and in today's Washington culture, that certainly is inappropriate. Now, in a cartoon culture, that may not matter, because in that culture there are no morals and no ethics, because there are no consequences that derive from either practicing immoral or moral behavior. But in the real world, there are consequences, and if we teach those, I hesitate to call them values, but if we teach those norms of behavior, then there are consequences. And those consequences are tragic. Now, they may not affect us directly, today or tomorrow or even perhaps in our lifetime, but they do have consequences. And those consequences are being visited upon us in the streets of Los Angeles, the streets of Atlanta, and the streets of virtually every community across America. Real consequences in the real world, unlike the cartoon culture of a Bill and Hillary Clinton, do have very, very real actions. Jerry and I visited about a year and a half ago one of our service academies. And it just so happened that at the time we were visiting that service academy, there was a scandal that was just about coming to a head involving a underclassman who had been caught cheating. Now, in years past, being caught cheating at a military academy would be subject to summary dismissal, and that would follow you for the rest of your life, that disgrace. Not so in the cartoon culture of the United States of America of 1997. This was about a year and a half ago. Nowadays, what happens, apparently, if you are caught cheating at a service academy, you have a team of lawyers hired to defend you, to file lawsuit, and to hire lobbyists in Washington to argue your case before the Secretary of the Branch of Service, who are these days more interested in political correctness than in military strategy. And what happens is precisely, unfortunately, what happened in this case. The Service Academy and the Secretary of that branch of the service decided that it simply was not worth the battle. So this person was not only kept in school, allowed to graduate, but any hint of having been caught cheating was wiped from her record. Now, in a cartoon culture, that may not matter. But in the real world, that may have very tragic consequences, not just for one or two people, but perhaps thousands. Who knows, 20 years from now, when that person is commanding a large group of men and women in a hostile environment, not one of those people serving under her command or from whom she receives commands know that 20 years before she had proved herself unworthy, that she had cheated, had cut corners, had taken liberties with the truth. Doing that in an academic environment, of course, is one thing. Doing that in a situation where the lives of hundreds, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of men and women are at stake can have very tragic consequences. We have in the Government Reform and Oversight Committee over the course of the last year uncovered a great deal of information that is already proving to have very serious consequences for this country. And I speak of something that Jack mentioned briefly, and as to which he has studied a great deal, and that is the links between this administration and Communist China. Now, in the real world, when you provide your adversary with the means to improve their technology, surprise, they improve their technology. In the real world, when you provide Communist China with enhanced missile technology to improve their guidance systems, surprise, they improve their guidance systems. When you, in the real world, provide missile technology to Communist China, they then in turn provide that technology and those instruments of death to other countries who are their allies or perhaps just business partners, such as Iran. No surprise then that we see Communist China doing precisely that. What are the consequences of that? We don't know. But they could be very, very devastating, not just to us directly, but to our allies and our friends around the world when they had those missiles targeted and used against them. Is there a link between those acts and the millions of dollars that we know for a fact flowed from Communist China to the Clinton-Gore campaign, directly into the White House, directly to the DNC? We don't know. But if you ask the average American about these things, most of them could care less. They don't understand the link. But ask them about Monica Lewinsky and they certainly will have an opinion. Unfortunately, it is those sorts of things that seem to spark any interest at all in most of our colleagues in Washington. The hours that we have spent in the Government Reform and Oversight Committee documenting the trips made by Chinese officials and those who are their minions, traveling from China to the United States with large amounts of cash money, directly into the White House, meeting with people like Mark Middleton on occasion after occasion after occasion, have generated at best an occasional article to be supported by the few great Americans we do have in the Congress, people like Jerry Solomon, Dan Burton. But among the leadership, a yawn perhaps. And yet who knows what sort of damage or how that damage will manifest itself in the years ahead. We don't know, but we do know that, particularly with regard to Communist China, they take a view of the world that is long-term. And, for example, we know that now that China has a foothold on both ends of the Panama Canal, both the Atlantic side and the Pacific side, that when the last vestige of United States presence in Panama is removed in December of 1999, thanks to Jimmy Carter, that China is poised to move in. They're already there. Is it any surprise that we see substantial investment in recent months and years by China in Cuba? We already know that they are investing heavily in Long Beach. Why then should it be a surprise to us when they're investing just 90 miles off the Florida coast? Of course, in the cartoon world of Bill Clinton, it doesn't really matter. We're all one big society, one big world. But we do know that these things have consequences. And despite the frustrations that constantly seem to meet our efforts in Washington and across the country, contacting individual members of Congress to wake up and pay attention to these things and to assist those of us who are trying to do something about it, despite those frustrations, we cannot let up. There is too much at stake. We have to keep pressing forward. Despite the fact that the Clinton administration is constantly stretching the limits of credibility in terms of its legal proceedings, we cannot let up. They are taking the notion of executive privilege and stretching it beyond even the limits that President Nixon attempted unsuccessfully. They are taking the notion that law enforcement officers in this country are sworn to uphold our Constitution and our laws, not pay allegiance to the death to an individual, such as a Praetorian Guard might. Despite that, despite the arguments made quite with a straight face by this administration and its lawyers and its counsel, that, for example, Secret Service agents are immune from having to testify in court as to criminal acts that they might have evidence of, we must not back down. We must stand for the rule of law, even those who are sworn to uphold the rule of law do not. Because if we don't, then nobody will. We also know that despite the fact that in a cartoon culture, in a cartoon world perhaps, if you surrender decision-making authority to somebody else and they, no surprise, take you up on the offer and start exercising that decision-making, it doesn't really matter. But in the real world, it does. When the United States surrenders decision-making authority to a neophyte bureaucrat named Kofi Annan, it should come as no surprise to us that he takes that decision-making power and exercises it and will not relinquish it. We also know that when you allow other organizations such as the United Nations to take under advisement such matters as international registration of firearms, that they take that ball and they run with it. And they are going to run with it in a conference coming up in Vienna in about 10 days. There is a United Nations Commission on Crime, and one of the major items that will be on their agenda is a proposition being pushed primarily, though not exclusively, by Canada and Japan, calling for international registration of firearms. Now, in a cartoon world, that may not matter. But in a real world, particularly in this country, it will matter. Because if we surrender that right to an international body, and they are allowed to start registering and controlling firearms, then we have indeed surrendered perhaps the last great way mechanism that we in this country have of defending ourselves. And we must never, ever do that. We do know also that, and Jerry pointed this out to me, this quote, we know in this country that the rule of law is important. Again, despite all the frustrations, we know that it's important. And we know that when supposedly learned lawyers go on national TV and say, ignore the law, ignore precedent, just pay attention to the will of the people, that will have very severe consequences. And that is what the president's lawyers and others who I suppose are lawyers, although I would be somewhat surprised, such as Mr. Ginsburg, that is the proposition that they not only adhere to but are willing to state. These people who quoted in the paper are saying these sorts of things, that don't pay any attention to the law, don't pay any attention to court decisions, just listen to the will of the people. We have a name for that in the real world, although in a cartoon world perhaps it doesn't matter. We do have the rule of law in this country. So I would urge that, as the John Birch Society has always done, and that is stick to the Constitution, stick to the truth, and never let up. That despite the tremendous frustrations that we see in Washington, not limited to one side of the political aisle or the other, that we rededicate ourselves to ensuring that the truth does prevail, that these issues are discussed over and over and over again, to rededicate ourselves to ensure that not one person with whom any one of us comes in contact during the course of every single 24 hours of every day that we are in contact with other people, that we rededicate ourselves to make sure that that person, whether it's somebody at a restaurant or somebody at a gas station or at our business, to make sure that they do not leave our presence without hearing from us about the great constitutional crisis that our country faces and how important it is for every citizen to be involved and to understand how important the rule of law is and to understand how important it is to reassert American sovereignty in all that we do. Because what happens in Vienna, Austria, or in Santiago, Chile, does have consequences here in this country, just as it does in those other countries. And there will be tremendous resistance, as I know everybody here knows, to those ideas, those radical ideas of constitutional law and constitutional principle. And they don't have anything to do with what the polls might say. They don't have anything to do with partisan political advantage. The Constitution is a Republican document or a Democrat document. It's an American document. And we must constantly, whether it is urging Republicans to stand up for what's right, or those conservative Democrats to stand up for what is right, we should not take no for an answer. Send another fax, make another phone call, send another petition in, send another email in. I know some of these folks in Washington get tired of it. We're hearing from some people who have called into some of the radio shows that I've had the pleasure and honor of being on for a second time, saying, Mr. Barr, we did what you told us several months ago. We contacted our congressman or one of the Republican leaders. We wrote to them. We emailed them. And we were told that they don't care, that they don't want to hear this anymore. Well, my advice is the same as it was 6 months ago. Write them again. Call them again. Fax them again. Just as Douglas MacArthur did not take no for an answer, we must not either. We must understand, as we do, and make sure that our fellow Americans understand that the battle that we are facing today is every bit as important as the battles that people like General MacArthur and Patton and Pershing were fighting 70, 80, 50 years ago, 47 years ago, and that just as they did not take no for an answer from their adversaries, we must not take no for an answer from our fellow citizens, even those in positions of high power in Washington. They must hear from us. Because that is the only way that when we think of Wile E. Coyote, who has run out over the cliff and his legs are still running, that is the only way that we will finally, at long last, make him accountable. And that is to make sure that we do not take no for an answer, that we press ahead with the Constitution, with the principles that are embodied by this group here this evening, and the work, Jack, that you began, I guess it was right around this time back in October of last year when you were launching your project, the impeachment project. And despite the fact that we only have 22 co-sponsors of HRS 304, an awful lot of members now know about it and know how important it is to their constituents. I mean, not to me. It isn't that they know that it's important to me. They sort of know that. But they know now how important it is to their constituents, and I suspect that they will know even more about how important it is next week and the week after that and the week after that. I suspect, Jack, that you're not going to let up. You're not going to take no for an answer. And neither should any of us. So please, let us rededicate ourselves this evening to that simple proposition that everybody with whom we come in contact over the course of these next weeks and months and years not leave our presence without hearing something from us directly about our Constitution and how important it is to reassert its principles in the daily life of this country, because this is not a cartoon world. This is the United States of America. And let's never take no for an answer. Thank you. Thank you, Jack. Very good.